increasing access to affordable health care, ensuring that every American has the right to vote, combating the rise of hatred and bigotry, and raising the minimum wage. Of course, many of these issues have become even much more important and relevant as we navigate the ongoing coronavirus pandemic. We are so grateful to Democratic leaders in Congress, including Max Rose, who are fighting to safeguard the health and well-being of the American people each day, including through the recent stimulus bill. We are also deeply appreciative of Congressman Rose for his service in the National Guard and his decision just announced this morning to deploy with the Guard in response to the crisis. In case you have not heard, Congressman Rose, who represents New York's 11th District, will deploy tomorrow to work at Staten Island's facilities to assist in the coronavirus response efforts, and we applaud his commitment. As a proud veteran of the U.S. Army and a member of the National Guard, Max serves on the House Committee on Veteran Affairs. In addition to this important work, Max also serves on the Homeland Security Committee, where he has led hearings and efforts to protect the Jewish community from the rise of anti-Semitism. And I can say firsthand and personally that I know how important Max Rose is to the American Jewish people, to the New York Jewish people. My family and I know him very well now. We consider him a good friend, and we are so proud of him. And from the first time I met him, I said, watch this guy. He's the real deal, and he's so genuine. Max, we are so deeply appreciative for your commitment to this country and your constituents, and are delighted that you agreed to join us today. Congressman Rose, over to you.
Oh, Karen, thank you. And the feeling's mutual. Thank you so much for your friendship. Ron, the entire JDCA team, thank you for everything you're doing, especially convening this great group today. Now, I would like to just take a few minutes to talk about the way forward from the perspective of New York City, New York State, and the lessons learned for the rest of the country, but also with an eye towards the challenges that New York is facing that other entities very well might not be facing now. This is a particular crisis right now. What I don't think is as useful right now is talking about what we should have done and talking about who was potentially at fault. We have people dying each and every day, my own constituents, New Yorkers, and people, there's deep human tragedy right now. So we can't afford for any type of partisanship, and we can't, unfortunately right now, pause for any type of self-reflection. So what's going on? We have seen, as you all are incredibly aware, this surge of this virus, that we are past the point where we can test our way out of this immediate pandemic surge. So we have to prepare for this inevitable surge of ICU patients. Right now, the number of hospital patients you see is reflective of social behavior roughly 3 weeks ago. If you remember 3 weeks ago in New York, although it feels like a distant memory, we were largely acting as if there was no crisis. So that means that the apex is still in front of us. And obviously, when we talk about bending the curve with social behavior, what we're largely saying is not that people won't get corona, but we are saying that we have to delay these types of things so that we can build up our hospital capacity. Now, whenever people talk about hospital capacity, there's 5 points to think about. And I'm really trying to simplify this. The first is make as many of our existing hospitals COVID only. And in order to do that, you have to provide for excess capacity on the non-COVID space. 2 weeks ago, I was the first elected official to publicly urge the president and the governor to bring the Naval Hospital into New York Harbor. That has now successfully docked the other day. We've also built Javits Center and other entities which are designed, in essence, to allow for our existing hospital structures to be COVID only, or for the majority COVID only. The second is that we have to, or part and parcel of that, is that we have to look at our entire healthcare system on a city and state level as one integrated healthcare system, not individual hospitals as we formerly looked at it. You know, it used to 6 weeks ago. Northwell, Presbyterian, Mount Sinai, yeah, they went to conferences together, but they weren't integrated structures. They had different nodes on the continuum of care as part and parcel of their own systems, but they managed their own P&Ls, managed their own quality, managed their own staffing. Those days are behind us when it comes to COVID. If Mount Sinai has to surge, New York Presbyterian needs to step in. The New York City public health system needs to be able to step in and take that COVID surge. But it can't just stop there. I have advocated successfully for the VA to open its doors to non-veteran patients. The Manhattan VA is now doing that. Again, integrating not just the city public hospitals, the private hospitals, but also a federal hospital system, which that's exactly what the VA is, into an integrated New York City-wide and New York State-wide hospital system. So now how do you prepare for a surge of COVID patients? There's 4 legs of a stool to this. At the center of it is the hospital staff, the medical professionals who are the real heroes of this. You know, Karen mentioned that I'm going to be going into the Guard tomorrow. My service, whatever it may be, pales in comparison to what these medical professionals have been doing. They're the frontline soldiers of this new war. And just as we were all horrified 15 years ago that we were sending soldiers to Iraq without the equipment they needed, we should be equally horrified that we have medical professionals on the front lines without the equipment they need. Now, surrounding that medical professional is the PPE, the ventilator, and the brick and mortar structure, whether it is a field hospital, the Javits Center, or a standalone hospital to support that medical professional. The PPE, the ventilator, the hospital structure are not useful at all if we do not have the staff. Not useful. So we have to figure out how do we protect those professionals, and then how do we have a surge of the ventilators, the PPE, and the structures. Now, New York City and New York State, but New York City in particular, we're in a very different situation than the rest of the country because of how quickly we're experiencing this surge. You see, the rest of the country, they're going to have time to prepare for this. Some less time than others, albeit. And what does that mean? They'll have time to buy ventilators. They'll have time to go out into the global market for PPE. They'll have time to figure out how to expand their existing hospital facilities or how to build field hospitals or integrate their healthcare systems. They have time. New York does not. Our apex is right around the corner. Hundreds, thousands dying. So we are in this urgent need for the federal government to center its resources, PPE, staff, ventilators, additional hospitals on New York City, because the rest of the country still has that room to build up. It is unfortunate that when you look at the global market for ventilators and PPE, other nations are exerting their purchasing power. We are not to the degree that we should. We have cities competing against cities, states competing against states, jacking up the price, and we're moving very slow. So we are suffering the consequences of this policy. Certainly, I'm a believer that the federal government has to exert all of its authorities at its disposal, to include the Defense Production Act. And we're seeing that come to fruition with what GM is doing. We should be doing more. You know, in World War II, the federal government stepped in and built factories. If you let the free market take over here, what so many of these private companies are saying is, look, I see a demand for the next 12 months, but I don't know if I see enough demand to justify building a new factory. I don't see if enough demand to justify buying additional equipment. The federal government could step in and do that. And it takes time, though, to transition another company towards this. It takes time for them to buy the resources. It takes time for them to build up the intellectual capital. So GM might be there 3 months from now when someone else is suffering. But right now, we have a fierce sense of urgency in New York. We cannot wait for GM. We cannot wait for a new factory to be built. There's a ventilator, it's got to come here. If there's excess federal capacity, it's got to come to New York. But we will defeat this. You know, we're the greatest country in the history of the world. New York City is the greatest city in the history of the world. And so what happens after we defeat this inevitable surge in serious COVID patients? Well, there's two things that I believe really has to happen. The first is that we have to model our testing paradigm after what we did at the height of the HIV/AIDS epidemic. And testing, we have to eliminate the mystery around testing. Testing is a swab, it's lab equipment, and it's lab reagents, the supplies for the lab test to be run. But the more people that are tested, the quicker that we can identify symptomatic and asymptomatic carriers, the quicker that we can isolate them and treat them and prevent an outbreak. Testing, testing, testing. That's what stops outbreaks. That's the only thing that can push this economy forward. But then lastly, we have to have a investment akin to what we did post 9/11 with a unified consensus effort to make sure that this never happens again. That means an unprecedented investment in the national stockpile. That means an unprecedented investment in our capabilities to foresee these pandemics coming, double down on our testing efforts. That means an unprecedented effort to have in place a system to surge hospital capacity in specific hotspots. We have to be prepared because we were caught flat-footed, and that should never happen again. So I hope that this, in a rather short period of time, kind of was a synthesis of what's happening. But ultimately, we have the best, most capable, most unbelievable patriots addressing this. And they're incredible heroes. And we should take a moment every day, and this moment included, to thank them for what they do and to express our gratitude, both publicly as well as within this conversation. So thank you again, JDCA. And Karen, I look forward to your biting, tough question.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Congresswoman Rose. And we know how extremely busy you are and really appreciate the time. Before you go, we would like to ask about your deployment. What are you seeing on the ground in New York City, and what will you do with the National Guard when you're deployed to your own district, Staten Island?
So look, when I'm a member of Congress, the generals call me sir, but when I'm in uniform, I'm just a lowly captain. So I'm going into this with no illusions of grandeur, just to do my small part and do my duty. In the military, you plan and God laughs. So I'm certain I'll play some type of operational role, Staten Island, New York City wide. And what that may be, as this crisis evolves, that too will evolve. But part and parcel of it, in the end, is supporting our healthcare institutions, managing a surge of COVID patients, and making sure that we're applying a whole of government approach. Where, and this is what's happening, our federal healthcare workers working alongside the VA, working alongside the military, working alongside FEMA, dedicating our resources, not in a silo, but in a highly integrated, holistic approach. That's the only way that government can work effectively. That's what I saw at the Javits Center, certainly under the extraordinary leadership of Andrew Cuomo. What we're doing is not just beating this virus, but we're also going to show the rest of the nation how to do it. There will be lessons learned out of this, and we will save lives throughout the country in the process.
Well, I can tell you, each one of us in the country sleep better knowing you're at the helm at what you do. We thank you so much. We send our best to you, your family. God bless you, and we look forward to speaking to you when you can next time.
Absolutely. Thank you. God bless you all. Thanks again.
I think we're going to hear from Barbara Goldberg-Goldman next.
Thank you so much, Karen, and you, Congressman Rose, for joining us. I am Barbara Goldberg-Goldman, and I am Vice Chair of JDCA's Board of Directors. And I want to continue our discussion with our next speaker, Sarah Bloom Raskin. She is the former Deputy Secretary of the United States Department of the Treasury and the second in command of the United States Treasury. She was the highest ranking woman in the history of the Treasury role. Sarah oversaw the entire Treasury Department and its various agencies and departments. And if her name sounds familiar to you, in fact, it is. She is married to Jamie Raskin, congressman from the 8th Congressional District in Maryland. And it's pretty special to have one star in your family, but when you have two, you have really risen highly. So prior to her confirmation as Deputy Secretary, Sarah served as governor of the Federal Reserve Board, where she helped conduct the nation's monetary policy and promote financial stability. Sarah's economic perspectives were shaped at the local level, where she was the Commissioner of Financial Regulation for the state of Maryland from 2007 to 2009, during the onset of the foreclosure crisis, something we can all remember. As commissioner, she and her agency were responsible for managing the effects of the financial crisis on Maryland's people and financial institutions, including the state chartered depository institutions, banks, credit unions, mortgage lenders, mortgage services, and trust companies. One of Sarah's defining economic perspectives relates to the notion of resilience, by which she means the ability of individuals, communities, institutions, policymakers, businesses, and nations to recover from shocks, which is why she is our perfect speaker and expert to hear from in this very moment. We're incredibly lucky to hear Sarah's insights on the economy at this critical moment, and I am most fortunate to be able to call her my friend. So before turning it over to Sarah, I also want to ask that you send your questions to Sarah to info@jewishdems.org. That's info@jewishdems.org. And we will take as many questions as we can. So thank you for joining us. And Sarah, over to you.
Well, thank you, Barbara, for that very kind introduction. And really, I have to say, it is a real pleasure to be able to talk through today with you all what is happening really on the economic side, given this pandemic. And as Barbara mentioned, I do focus very much on this idea of bounce back, of resilience. What is it going to take to actually move our economy to a place where we can recover? Now, I should start by saying, of course, that this is a health crisis, first and foremost. The economy has indeed really suffered some dramatic events in the last several weeks. But primarily, we have to keep in mind that this is a health crisis. And until we get ahead of the health crisis, we can pour, millions, trillions of dollars at the issue, and still will not be able to recover if we don't get the fixes made from the pandemic side. So I want to preface it by saying that. I'm going to be talking about the economy, but of course, I want everybody to understand that this starts really, the root of the economic issues really are these health issues. Let me also frame these remarks by noting that marked as the most, as the most dramatic months for economic policymaking in modern memory. What I'm going to speak to is the notion of economic policymaking, what has happened here, what has been the reaction at the federal level, both from as well as the fiscal side, the congressional stimulus reaction to the economic issues. So I will talk about the policy making that has happened on both sides, both the Fed and the Treasury side, and the congressional side. And then I want to talk a little bit about where we are now, which of course is the implementation piece, and how this stimulus money is moving through the plumbing, so to speak, of our economy to land where it is supposed to. So speaking first really to the sort of the overarching reason why these stimulus measures have occurred, and what the theory really has been behind them and the rationale for this huge amount of stimulus. As many of you might have noticed, the amount of dislocation that has been taking place in the economy because of the need to shut down has been extraordinarily hard on business. So businesses have had to shut down. People have had to work from home. Many people have actually, who can't work from home, who don't have those kinds of jobs, have actually been laid off. There have been massive numbers of layoffs. There have been massive amounts of hours reduced. And in addition to people who have traditional relationships with an employer, there have also been a whole class of individuals who, you might think of as Schedule C people, 1099 people, the gig employees. These are all similar terms for a type of employee who does not have a traditional relationship with an employer. These people have also suffered mightily in terms of the reaction to this crisis. So from the economic side, we have seen, obviously in the markets, massive reductions in shareholder value, in shareholder wealth. We have seen, outside of the market reaction, we have seen huge numbers of unemployment claims. So the unemployment claim numbers came in I'm losing track of time, maybe about 4 or 5 days ago, and the numbers were more than anybody had ever imagined. So this indicated that people are already being laid off. Their hours are already being reduced. And so what we have, in essence, what we have seen is massive amounts of unemployment. And what this means in terms of an ability to bounce back is that if people, of course, are unemployed or don't have a means of being able to bring in income, they themselves are going to have a hard time paying bills and staying afloat. And of course, as this persists, if people are not then able to get new jobs, new positions, new sources of income and revenue, then what happens is they themselves become unable to consume. And this, of course, keeps firms then from rehiring or from being able to imagine expanding because they don't have a source of demand for their goods and services. So you see here a linkage really between what is happening on the employment side and then what happens on the business side. And it becomes a downward vicious cycle if you can't get ahead of it. So that's really where these stimulus packages came into play, okay? First, the Fed. So the Fed did massive amounts of liquidity provision. Now, this liquidity did not go into the pockets of small business or even into the pockets of large business or the pockets of households. This money was moved primarily through the markets, and you will, if you are a market nerd and you follow a lot of this, you will see the actions that the Fed took to ease up monetary policy significantly. So one way to think about it is the faucets were all turned on, the spigots were all turned on very high as they could go. And not only did the Fed use the spigots that it's used to using, but it found some others. And the others that they found were spigots that actually they had not used before. So in the first phase of the Fed's work, it did some of the very traditional things it would do in a crisis. It turned the interest rates down all the way to zero. This is called, in Fed parlance, it's called the zero lower bound. So the interest rates moved down to zero as far as the Fed could get them to zero. And that was one of the first actions the Fed took. Immediately thereafter, the Fed started purchasing Treasury securities of different durations as well as corporate bonds. So this is, for those of you who remember the financial crisis, quantitative easing was the purchase of the purchase of Treasury securities of certain durations in certain amounts. What the Fed has now done is saying, we are going to do whatever it takes. They're not even saying how much they're buying. They're not saying when they're going to stop buying. They're making this completely open-ended. They are buying treasuries of all durations. They are expanding their purchases into corporate debt of an investment grade quality. That is a new feature. So you see here from the Fed side, massive amounts of liquidity being put into the system. At the same time, the Fed is also creating different facilities by which they hope to help businesses, and I'll turn to that in a second. But that's the Fed side, the monetary policy side. The same time that the Fed did this first, and then it came to Congress and a stimulus package. The Treasury Department put together a stimulus package with certain terms in it. It moved first through the Senate and then to the House. Because of the nature of this crisis, time being of the essence, the House ended up accepting the Senate version. So there was not a lot of time to debate in this. And yet what came out of it, there's actually quite a bit of good things that came out of it, kind of some other things that we got to keep an eye on that might not have been so great. But a package was put together. And for those of you who follow this, you will know that this was the largest stimulus package, not just in the history of the United States, but in the history of the world. So this is a massive amount of fiscal impetus. Now, to quote, this is kind of a quote from Milton Friedman of all people, but here is what Milton Friedman said, and I'll tell you why it's relevant. He said, only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. So that's what we're dealing with now. We have a crisis. It's not actually a perceived one, it's an actual one, and it is going to produce real change. The actions that have been taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. So when we say that and when we observe that, it means that the way this response has unfurled is by using the systems and the ideas that were lying around. Are they the best ideas? They may not be, but they were some of the ideas that were laying around, and they're the ones that are being used. Let me be specific. There's certain features to the fiscal stimulus. One feature is this idea of direct cash payments. So households are going to be receiving direct cash payments. Okay. That's an idea that was lying around. It had not been used in a while since the last financial crisis, but essentially it's this idea of writing checks directly to households, capping them at a certain amount based on the need of the household, having no questions asked, not looking at too many factors regarding the needs of the household, just sending the checks out. Okay. Query as to whether that's always the best approach, but it was an idea that was lying around and it was picked up and it's being moved on. So there will be direct cash payments to households. Again, the theory here is that if these cash payments can be received in time, they can help cushion the blow to an already economically fragile set of households in our country. Similarly, another idea that has now been expanded upon is to use unemployment insurance as a mechanism for actually bringing about a bigger cushion for people who are being laid off. This would be a cushion for people who not only have lost their jobs, but for people who have had their hours reduced, and importantly, those important Schedule C gig employee 1099 people who used to have no access at all to the unemployment insurance system. So again, here was a mechanism. It was the unemployment insurance system, which is run through the various states in different ways, but there is a system there, and using that system, expanding upon it as a means to get money out to people in a quicker way. I think my time might be coming to an end, and I don't want it to, because there's still a really important feature here that needs to be explored, which is the notion of getting money into the hands of businesses, into the hands of small businesses in particular. that big bill that Congress just passed addresses that as well. And we can talk about that maybe in some Q&A, but getting businesses to be able to have real access to liquidity, especially small businesses. Small businesses right now trying to figure out how they're going to get by in the next couple months without having to lay off workers. What are the features of this stimulus that are helping small business? Really important to keep an eye on. Let me also sort of end before we do some questions with this notion of the faucets and the plumbing. So we talked about, turning on the faucets, as many as you can and as many as you can find. And we've put a lot, we have put in, there's a lot of faucets there, and we've turned them all up really high. The question is, will they get through the plumbing? So it's not just a question of turning everything up high, but making sure that they're going to move through the plumbing and get to their intended uses. And that's what I've been keeping an eye on, and we all need to keep an eye on, which is all of this money needs to land where it's supposed to land, and in a timely way, because as we've seen, the economy is very precarious right now in terms of its ability to try to move back into a recovery that we would like to see as more robust, but if not handled well, could keep us at a sort of at a downturn for quite a while. So I will stop there and really open it up to questions here, what are on people's minds, and try to answer things as best I can.
Great, thank you so much, Sarah. My name is Haley Soifer. I'm Executive Director of JDCA, and I'm going to be moderating the questions that have been sent in. So one of the issues that you have focused on in your work is the notion of resilience, by which you mean the ability of individuals, communities, institutions, and policymakers and businesses to recover from shocks. How does this compare to previous economic shocks? And Susie from New York has asked, how long can our country sustain an economic shutdown?
Great. Well, Susie and Haley, thank you for that question. So this idea of shocks, this is a huge shock, okay? This is a shock that hit both, and I'm going to get really kind of wonky on this, both the demand side and the supply side at the same time, meaning that the usual policy tools were not available to work in a way that you would think. Now, the other thing to keep in mind about this shock is it's not an economic shock primarily. It only became an economic shock after we were unable to recover from the pandemic. So when it became a pandemic, that was the shock. And then it bled into the economy because the economic response was to be shut down, to be, to stay at home, to close and shutter our places of commerce and our places of business, and to conduct as much commerce as we could from our homes. When that transition happened, the economy was bound to suffer, and indeed has suffered. I think that as we move through as we try to see how long this can last, it's going to primarily depend on the progress that is made in dealing with the pandemic. If we can turn the corner on the pandemic, you will then start to see an ability for the economy to recover. But my own contention is that it's not going to recover fully if and as long as we are still dealing with the pandemic in the way that we're dealing with it, which very rightfully has to be an ability to quarantine and stay away from others. I think that our economy has some very interesting ways of adapting. You've seen some pretty amazing new businesses emerging and new ways of serving people. But that is all going to take a whole lot of time, and it's clearly not going to absorb all the all of the economic talent that our country has and has lost, frankly, by virtue of having to move people indoors.
Great. We have a few questions related to small businesses. Steve from Maine asks, what can be done to save much of the direct service industries like restaurants, bars, and entertainment venues? And Steve from Atlanta asks a related question, how do we make sure small business loans and grants provided in the CARE Act get to them in time? With rent and payroll due tomorrow and SBA loans placed through local banks, they will be overwhelmed when the employees may be constrained and go to unemployment. So what can be done to help our small businesses?
And those are great questions, Steve. Steve and Steve.
Steve and Steve.
So, and I have been very concerned about this aspect of our ability to bounce back, because the truth of the matter is restaurant owners, dry cleaners, entertainment venues, a lot of small businesses, they don't rely on loans. It's a very hard business. They have they have narrow margins, and this idea of making them go through loans to get their balance sheets to be in a place where they can figure out how to pay their rent is really difficult. Of course, what goes without saying, and as you both know, the revenue side is flat. You can't, obviously restaurants cannot manage without customers, and there are no customers unless they're somehow takeout options and such. But for the most part, there are so many small businesses that are just unable to be able to move forward. The idea that they would get loans, so the CARE Act has tried to make the terms of these loans easy. They're going to be forgivable. They're going to be supposedly quick. They're going to get out there where they need to be without questions asked. There will be, again, this forgivable piece, so they'll in essence become grants if people are able to, if the small business owner can hold on to the employees. The amounts can be quite significant in terms of the payroll of the prior, it'll be based on the amount of the loan will be based on the payroll that the small business has to incur. So they are designed to be very, very useful. What we have to see is we have to see the Small Business Administration be able to get these out the door very quickly. Again, this goes to my point about the plumbing. So I think we've got the faucet turned up here. There's a lot of money here that could be tapped into and that could be forgivable. These will be loans that will not have to be paid back, which is really great. But they've got to get out in time. And as you both have pointed out, with your bills coming up and the things you have to pay, it's going to be a challenge, because you have bills that are due and you've got to have something to pay them with.
Great. Michael from Atlanta asked, Congressman Rose talked about the problems by states bidding against each other for PPE and equipment to get to the first responders and the healthcare workers on the front lines. Why haven't the state governors organized a consortium which could then act as a single bidder that could distribute the PPE where it is most needed and on an ongoing basis? And on a related note, I would also add that Congressman Rose mentioned the Defense Production Act. So if you don't mind just talking about the economic implications of it in general terms before getting to the specifics of this issue of a potential consortium.
So it's a very, very thoughtful question. There are possibilities that are opened up with the triggering of the Defense Production Act that could have significant it could be like a significant lubricant in getting protective equipment and necessary supplies to where they need to be in a much more efficient way. this issue of of states bidding against each other that is a complete friction point. I mean, that should be something that that we figure out ways to eliminate. I hadn't thought of your idea of a consortium. I think it's really quite novel. I would pose it to the National Governors Association, who I think could be in a position to try to talk about why that can't happen. Even if they started even regionally, it wouldn't, if you can't get all 50 on board, okay, so be it. But if they started with the concept that they were going to purchase, groups of states would purchase together as a way of trying to eliminate the potential price gouging and also the inefficiencies that come with 50 states having to bid against each other. It would be so remarkable if we had a system that was a unified system here, a national procurement model rather than a 50-state procurement model. So your instincts are very good. Maybe this is something that gets looked at in the next stimulus package, which I am afraid is coming. But I would keep those ideas fresh, and I think we should watch also how states do in terms of being able to get equipment and the price they pay.
Susie from New York has asked, does the current administration have the bandwidth and expertise to implement these programs to get the money to those who need it? Or are there too many obstacles in their way? And I would also add, given your experience having worked in the previous administration, just how does this team compare in terms of the economic expertise at the top?
Thank you for that, Susie. And I have to say, I've been thinking a lot about, like, if I were in that role today, what I would be attempting to do, because it is a real operational challenge now to get this money out the door to its intended uses in the best way possible. And I'm concerned that if we don't do this, or if they don't do this right, essentially we're going to have almost a two-tiered recovery, where we might be seeing, on the economic side, we might be seeing some sectors start to recover in a way that is, that leaves behind households and small businesses. I'm concerned about that because I know of differential implementation methods that are used by different agencies, and it's a problem that they're not coordinated. In terms of your general question about expertise, and this has also concerned me because this current administration has done a lot to strip government, frankly. So a lot of the people who I would normally rely on at Treasury are gone. Obviously, there are, the people who were political appointees are not there, but the career people, the people who were there regardless of administration, they were there, with the R's, they were there with the D's, they're there, and they have really good expertise. And these are the people who really understand how to do things. A lot of them are gone. I tried to call over there actually this morning because I was looking for some answers on some issues having to do with this direct cash payment and how it was, how it was getting implemented. And then I realized, like, nobody is there. Now, of course, they're physically not there because they're not there. Everybody is at home trying to do this. But I was very concerned now with this kind of gutting of government, at least as I see it in the Treasury Department, because these are the people who really understand fiscal services. They understand how to move on these things, and to have to reinvent the wheel now, we don't have that kind of time. So it is an issue, Susie, that you really put your thumb on really quite accurately. It's important, I think, to have the expertise you need. On the Treasury side, I was told today that Treasury, because they realize they have gaps, they are calling back people who have gone into retirement. You know, they're trying to get expertise back. Again, this is like not the way you do things. You should be prepared going in, but this is what it is. And hopefully they'll get in some good people, the people who know how to do these things and be able to get these things and these programs moving the way they should. And again, goes to my point of the plumbing. We can, you know, you can have Congress provide all the money in the world, and yet if it can't move through the plumbing because the plumbing hasn't been maintained, that's an issue.
Great. We have two questions related to unemployment. One from Libby in Atlanta. How does unemployment for independent contractors work? For example, my daughter is an independent theater director. She can't get work right now because the theaters are dark. Normally, when you apply for unemployment, you have to list your employer. Does that not apply now? That's the first question. And Justin from Canada has asked a question comparing our model of employment to the Canadian model, where he asked, do you see any future reform of the American unemployment benefit regime to include self-employed individuals? Could this be done by the federal government or only state by state?
Okay, I love both those questions. So I will start, and Hallie, thank you for linking them because they are definitely linked. And so Libby, I'll start with the question of your daughter as a theater director. So traditionally, traditionally before this crisis, self-employed people, who she is not, but self-employed people, the kind that Justin mentions, would have a hard time getting unemployment insurance. It was the systems in the 50 states were not set up for them. What has happened in the CARE Act, which I think is really an extraordinary step, and we're going to have to seize upon this and institutionalize it state by state, because I can't guarantee it's going to work in 50 states. But again, here's a system. The system that we had in the US is the unemployment insurance system. It is at the state level. The funding comes in federally, but it's run out of the 50 states. That might need a change. But here was the system. It was ready to go. And so what the drafters of the CARE Act did, and what they thought was, let's use that unemployment insurance system, the plumbing that's already set up there, the systems that are there, let's use it to actually get and expand unemployment insurance. So it's a misnomer already, because one expansion has been to make it eligible for people who haven't been laid off yet, but who have had their hours reduced. So that's already an expansion of the concept of how you can get hurt by an exogenous shock from a labor perspective. And that's a really good expansion. The other expansion is in terms of Schedule C, self-employed people, 1099 people, the gig employee. Before this, there was no way those people had access to anything resembling an unemployment insurance. Now they do. Now, again, it has to get implemented state by state, because that's the system that we have here, but that's what we're going to, that's the mechanism. And I think if it can work, it is really an important expansion of assistance to a shock. And I would argue, not merely from a compassionate perspective, but from a good economic functioning perspective, it gets people on their feet and able to work and able to do things much sooner than would have been the case. So this is a really good step. And to Justin's point, we will look at the Canadian. I mean, it would be great to see the Canadian model. We have our model. This is our model, and this was what we started with. But I think what's really important here is that this is going to be hard to turn off. This is something that we really should hold on to and try to build, and people will come to expect this kind of safety net feature, I think, for all our employees, not just people who are, have a traditional relationship with a particular kind of employer, but everybody. And I think it's going to be hard to go back from that. So I like this feature, but I think it's going to need work. And maybe, to Justin's point, at some point it will get it will get nationalized. But at this point, it's 50 states, and we're going to have to see how it works. But it's got some potential.
Okay, and for our last question, we actually, because this is a series now, we're getting into a bit of a rhythm, and just given how difficult this moment is for all of us and for our country, we're trying to end on a positive note. So having looked at American history and previous financial shocks in the past, I'm hoping that we can end on somewhat of a positive note. What gives you reason for hope that we have better days ahead here, and what can we all look to in terms of reasons to be hopeful that we will recover from this soon in the future?
So I think we have done an extraordinary amount in this country to respond to a shock that very few people expected. And what we have seen in these dark days is that there are ways to respond. There are ways. We can't say anymore that something is off the table, that we would never engage in, for example, a solution to our student loan debt problem, or a solution to our climate change problem, because we do know how to activate. We do know how to bring policy to bear in a way that actually can help people, and we can do it in a short period of time. So I think one hopeful aspect of these dark days is that we know how to act. And we know that we can't be taking no as an answer for a lot of things anymore, because when there are ideas and good ideas, there are ways to move forward. And I think we're seeing some of those ideas emerge. I would encourage people to continue to think of ideas, because as I mentioned before, sometimes we just pick up the ones that we see lying around the floor, but we do need new ideas. It's a time for new ideas. And we're going to see some of those new ideas have greater traction as we move out of this crisis.
Great. Thank you. Over to our chairman, Ron Klein, to wrap it up. Oh, looks like Ron is muted. One moment, Ron. Can we unmute?
Thank you. We got it. Sorry. Thank you, Haley. Thank you, Karen, for your introduction of Congressman Raskin, and Barbara for your introduction of Sarah. Sarah, thank you very much. Very insightful. Your experience at this moment in time is very important for us to take what you said and how you analyze things, and for us all to think as a country forward on how we're going to respond. Particularly the last couple of comments about it gives some inspiration to know that we're capable of doing anything we want to do, and Americans are incredibly responsive and resilient when they want to be. So even sometimes when the lack of national leadership is not there, that's just my personal opinion, not yours, but that's something that we as an organization, JDCA, are going to focus on. We also want to thank Congressman Raskin for his service, and not only his service as a congressman, but serving the National Guard in Staten Island and the New York area. This is an important moment for all of us, and we appreciate everybody joining us in these series. This is our third call in what we're calling Democrats Lead in Crisis. And each one of our speakers has been extra special in terms of sharing their specific area of expertise. Our next call is this week, again, same time. It's going to be Thursday at 3 p.m., every Tuesday and Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern. This time we're going to look at education and the workforce with the president of the American Federation of Teachers, Randy Weingarten. And stay tuned for our special Passover call next Tuesday as well. But obviously education is very important, and the impact on education, both not only at the K through 12 level, but even beyond, obviously community colleges and how they're impacted, higher education and graduate education and training, what it means for the future of our country, how this moment will change some of those things. We also would like to direct you to our website, jewishdems.org, which is our JDCA website. It gives you information about how to get involved with what we're doing. We invite you to join our state JDCA chapters. For those of you on college campuses, or will eventually be returning to college campuses, we have active campus operations in many states where the Electoral College will matter this year. And we're also going to be organizing digitally in advance of what I think all of us would consider the most important election of our lifetime. So we thank you. We ask for your support of both your time, your interests, your financial resources, and support our efforts in making sure that this next election takes our country in a better direction. So happy to talk to you again on Thursday. Stay healthy and safe, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.